Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe's founding leader, is dead. Some saw him as a liberator, others a tyrant. So what legacy does he leave, and how will Zimbabwe emerge from his shadow? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashim Ahelbara. Robert Mugabe was a divisive figure right up until he died on Friday at the age of 95. He was hailed a hero of Zimbabwe's independence from Britain, but after a turbulent 37 years as president, the military deposed him in 2017. African leaders are paying tribute to Mugabe as an icon of liberation, but his critics say his thirst for power left Zimbabwe in ruins. Huda Abdel Hamid takes a look back at Robert Mugabe's life.
1965, Rhodesia and Ian Smith's white settlers declare independence from Britain, an event that defined Robert Mugabe's life and still haunts his country. The black majority resisted racist rule in the cities and out in the countryside, where a vicious bush war raged for years. Robert Mugabe, a teacher turned activist, emerged from prison as an articulate leader of the independence struggle.
We started the war in order to get our country, and we haven't got our country.
They did get their country at Lancaster House in London in 1979. And when Zimbabwe celebrated independence, Mugabe, the overwhelming winner of elections, was in power, and soon showing rival liberation fighters what he'd do to keep it. Matabeleland in the early 80s, the opposition crushed thousands killed in ethnic massacres, atrocities that were barely noticed abroad. But there was also much to admire: racial reconciliation, education and health for millions of Zimbabweans. Although later the economy declined and the invasions of white farms in the year 2000 were a turning point, this time the world did notice. It was a chaotic, destructive process, but Mugabe said he was correcting an old injustice and in many ways still fighting the old colonial power.
The land is ours, we give it to whom we please. It's not the business of Britain, you see, to tell us who to give land and who not.
By now, opposition was growing. Despite torture, murder and manipulation, many Zimbabweans seemed ready to throw Mugabe out. They had a new hero, Morgan Tsvangirai, who said Robert Mugabe's early achievements will always be overshadowed by the years of oppression.
Do we portray him as the great liberator, or do we portray him as somebody who has betrayed the liberation that he fought for? I think the latter will prevail.
The two rivals ended up in government together, although Mugabe made sure he kept the real power, and Tsvangirai later returned to opposition, where he would eventually die.
He is a despot, he's a dictator, he's a tyrant, he's any word you want to throw at him, but he's something more than that. He's the wrong messenger with the right message.
By now, his wife Grace, 41 years his junior, had emerged as a political player. Mugabe, well into his 90s, seemed determined to go on and on. In the cities, anger boiled over. A new generation demanded Mugabe go.
It's time for you to resign. It's time for you to step down.
In the end, it was the army that pushed him, worried he'd appoint Grace as his successor. A former colleague and deadly rival of Grace's, Emerson Mnangagwa, took over. It was more palace coup than revolution, although the joy mirrored that of Zimbabwe's original revolution 37 years earlier. Mugabe retreated to his mansion, bitter to the last.
Zimbabwe doesn't deserve it.
The real tragedy? Robert Mugabe could never bear the idea of his country enjoying a second freedom from his ruinous grip.
Let's bring in our guest in Harare, Patrick Chinamasa, a ruling ZANU-PF party member who served as Robert Mugabe's finance minister. In London, Alex Magaiza, the former chief advisor to the former Zimbabwean prime minister and opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai. And in Johannesburg, David Moore, Professor of Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Welcome to you all. Patrick, the mixed reactions following the death of Mr. Mugabe, from a liberator to a tyrant, does that, in a way or another, fairly sum up his legacy?
Well, Zimbabwe and the people of Zimbabwe are going to be in deep mourning over the passing on of Comrade R.G. Mugabe, who has been our leader and a revolutionary icon who championed and led the armed struggle which gave us our freedom, our human rights, and our dignity. He will be one of the greats of Africa, alongside former Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Agostinho Neto, Kenneth Kaunda, Nelson Mandela. He is a revolutionary icon, not just an African icon, but also internationally. He championed the cause of oppressed people everywhere. And he was very principled, he was very strong, and he's one of a few leaders in post-colonial Africa who has taken heads-on colonial masters and wrested our land to give it back to its rightful people. He was unflinching in that resolve.
Okay.
He left a huge legacy for empowerment of our people in the area of education. Zimbabweans are now rated the highest in terms of literacy rate and also in terms of skills development. This is why you find Zimbabweans all over the world because of their skills.
And it seems
he also
Mr.
made contributions to health, but the biggest achievement was giving land back to its rightful people.
We will talk more in details about those particular
things. The history would have been different.
Issues. Alex, Morgan Tsvangirai, who was the main opposition leader in Zimbabwe, once said that if we were to make any assessment about the legacy of Mugabe between a freedom fighter or someone who had usurped the right given to him by his own people, the latter would prevail.
Well, I think, first of all, condolences, of course, to the family of former President Mugabe. I've listened to what former Minister Chinamasa has said. There's no doubt that Mr. Mugabe played an important role in the liberation of Zimbabwe and had many important words to say about Africa. And he was indeed an icon in that regard. However, as Tsvangirai pointed out at the time, there are also aspects of Mr. Mugabe's leadership which were very disagreeable, which were very horrible. And I think that it's important to understand that even at this particular point in time, while we have to respect the family of Mr. Mugabe, it's also important to be honest and truthful about the challenges that Zimbabwe has faced. Zimbabwe faced under his leadership. Mr. Chinamasa was part of a group of people in ZANU-PF who led the ouster of President Robert Mugabe in 2017. I don't think that it is fair to whitewash that episode of our history. If anything, the demise of former President Robert Mugabe began that November 2017 when they took power from him through unconstitutional means.
Patrick, I mean, when we go back and look at the highlights of the legacy of Mugabe, many people would tell you that, okay, he was a freedom fighter for the independence of his own country, but those credentials were completely overshadowed by the blunders, by the mistakes that he made over many, many years in power.
I don't agree with that proposition. What I think people should know about Mugabe is that he was very angry that we had an African opposition, Zimbabwean opposition, financed and created by former colonial masters, the British, through the Westminster Foundation funded the creation and establishment of MDC. He was very, very angry that Zimbabweans, how could Zimbabweans betray their own legacy? How could Zimbabweans betray their own country by accepting silver in order to oppose the land question? He was very angry over that issue. So the issue that is raised here about the events of 2017, we are not perfect. We all have our shortcomings. But Mugabe's shortcomings pale into insignificance when compared with his achievements, not just in Zimbabwe, but internationally. And one shortcoming that I could own up to is that he left the succession issue too late. And as you know, because of advancement in age, he basically things were getting out of control. And a clique of individuals surrounded his wife in order to advance their own personal interests, which had nothing to do with the country's national interests.
Okay.
That is what led to the events of 2017.
Let's go
They were not events targeting anti-Mugabe. It was basically that change was now inevitable.
Okay, let's go to David Moore in Johannesburg. David, it was quite interesting, the reactions we got from African leaders, basically describing Mr. Mugabe as an icon of the Pan-African pro-independence movement. But when it comes to the West, the main sentiment was basically this was a tyrant who abused his power for many decades, which led or which drove the country to the brink of collapse.
Right. Well, statesmen and diplomats protect each other generally, and I think that's been the case. Oftentimes, if you speak to diplomats behind closed doors and off the record, they say quite different things, and they certainly have had in the past. But Robert Mugabe has been able to marshal the ideology of sovereignty and Pan-Africanism to put them on their back feet, usually. Except, of course, in 2008, when, after the victory of Morgan Tsvangirai in the election at the end of March, forced a runoff. Well, it forced a lot of fake counting as well, but that's not unusual. And Mugabe and his people killed at least, the very least, 177 MDC supporters. At that time, SADC and the AU had had enough and pushed him into a unity government. But he was able to make that work to his benefit as well, which he's always been able to do. He's been very good at picking out the soft spots in the opponent's armor and also pitching various camps in his own party, but also in the international arena, especially during the Cold War, at each other and been able to sneak through those cracks and maintain himself in power. He's very, very good at that. I think it's very interesting that in some contradiction to your former speaker, the people on the streets are actually indicating, I would say, a 30-70 percentage ratio against and for Robert Mugabe. And that's fairly unique in these days because people generally they don't like to speak ill of the dead. But there's already indications that his real legacy is not as good as it's been made out to be.
Alex, with Zimbabwe turning the chapter of Robert Mugabe, do you see an opening for what could be a fresh political start in the country?
Well, I think that if the events of November 2017 had not happened, and if Mr. Mugabe had passed on while he was in power, perhaps one would be talking of a new, fresh chapter coming up. But I think what we have seen so far is that Mr. Mugabe's political death happened in November 2017. And contrary to what we are hearing from my countryman, Mr. Chinamasa, they have been trying their level best over the past 12 months, 18 months, to distance themselves from the legacy of Mr. Mugabe. It's only now that they are calling him Comrade Mugabe because it's a title that they often use for their own colleagues and friends. In their newspapers, they've been calling him Mr. Mugabe and all sorts of things. So It's a bit hypocritical, so to speak, that he's being applauded and given all these accolades now, when for the past 12, 18 months, they have treated him like a leper, really. Now, in terms of Zimbabwe going forward, I think that clearly the challenges that were supposed to be solved in November 2017 have not been resolved. The last election in July 2018, left a lot of hanging questions, and that's why Zimbabwe continues to suffer serious isolation, serious economic deterioration. As has been said by many people, the solutions to Zimbabwe's challenges lie in the political arena, and it is there that Zimbabweans have to find a solution. The passing on of Mr. Mugabe does not have the same impact that it would have had he passed on during his time in power.
Mr. Patrick, I've listened to you defending the legacy of Mr. Mugabe, but at a certain point, this is my, if you could just bear for a second, this is my question to you, Mr. Chinamasa.
Morgan Tsvangirai did not win the 2008 elections. The Constitution provided for a two-stage process. If a candidate did not achieve 50% plus one, there was to be a rerun. The fact that he led in the first stage does not make him a winner of an election. I want just to correct
No, but you should at least
and
give...
I also want to correct the impression
Mr.
that
Patrick,
we are being hypocritical. It's not true.
You should just give some credit to Tsvangirai, because in the second round of the election he said...
To consolidate the achievements.
Okay, just going back to what you said about 2008, you should just give some credit to Tsvangirai, who said that I cannot afford to see more people killed because of the election, and therefore he decided to stay away from the second round of the vote. But this is my question to you. I've listened to you, you're defending the legacy of Robert Mugabe, but there is a universal consensus that the Gukuruhundi massacres committed in the Matabele land was one of the gravest crimes committed during the reign of Robert Mugabe. Still, you're completely in denial about it.
As you know, the liberation of this country was brought about by two liberation movements, two liberation nationalist movements. At independence, ZANU won the majority and went into a coalition with ZAPU. But disagreements, like among all revolutionaries, take place. Misunderstandings take place. And some of these misunderstandings are spawned by those who wanted to seek destabilization. So that period is regrettable, but Zimbabweans will find a solution amongst ourselves without the involvement of outsiders.
Okay.
I just wanted to highlight here.
Yeah, but how
we have never been hypocritical.
Mr. Patrick, how can you move in?
We have not been hypocritical with respect to his legacy.
I see your point. How can you move forward if you're not willing to acknowledge mistakes that were made, crimes that were committed in the past? Reconciliation is foremost about saying we made mistakes.
President Mugabe was the first to announce the policy of racial reconciliation with former colonial masters. That was a very important decision that he took. And he was always a man of peace, a man of reconciliation. And the current president has already given this matter of Gukuruhundi to the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which is superintended by Vice President Mohadi. So we will find our solutions without interference from outsiders. We know our problems, and it is very important that outsiders leave us alone. The problem about Zimbabwe is an opposition which is funded by the former colonial masters to cause destabilization in this country. There was reference to last year's election.
We have never. And this is exactly what Robert Mugabe has been saying for 37 years.
Cleanest elections, but someone went on to announce that he had won before even the elections were started, before even the votes were counted, and sent hooligans
If
on
you
the
don't mind,
street
Mr.
on the
Patrick,
1st of August.
I
That,
need to,
of course, is unacceptable.
okay, I need to include David Moore here. David, the factional divide is something which has been endemic in different parts of the African continent. And when it comes to Zimbabwe, you have the Ndibeles and the Shona. Is this something which you think would further continue to undermine the chances for any political reconciliation in the future in Zimbabwe?
I think it's a bit difficult to hear you, but I think the way in which the reconciliation attempts are going ahead is creating some more divisions in Matabeleland than one would hope. And that could be the way in which the current regime is handling some of these issues. I think overall, one can see quite clearly from Patrick Chinamasa's response a very a rote ZANU-PF response to some of these issues that you've raised. And I think perhaps Robert Mugabe's last words that were publicly announced on February 21st of this year on his 95th birthday, that sort of sanctimonious, holier than thou, I've never done any wrong discourse of actually blaming Emerson Mnangagwa for the deaths in January of this year, when at least 17 people were killed in the demonstrations. And he said something to the effect that, are you only happy when you're killing people? Why is it that death makes you happy? Something like that. And that's kind of indicated the sensibility that I think Robert Mugabe has left among people in power, and even people contesting for power. This kind of religiosity about it. I think Mugabe really did think that he could save ZANU-PF from falling apart. By playing off factions against each other. But that, of course, at one moment would help him keep in power, but at the same moment, and sort of put things in balance again. But then he would have to put things in imbalance again in order to keep that sort of factionalism going, but simultaneously cool down a bit. And that, in the end, has probably destroyed ZANU-PF. I don't think we even now, with Mnangagwa in, have a cohesive security force. We don't have economic issues solved. So Mugabeism, in a sense, has remained, even though at sometimes the new regime has said it's trying to reverse the difficulties.
This is going to be my question to Alex. Very briefly, Alex, there were hopes that the post-Mugabe legacy with Emerson Mnangagwa in power would see dramatic change when it comes to the reforms of the political laws and the economy. People seem to be really disillusioned now more than ever.
Well, when Mr. Mnangagwa came in 2017, there were a lot of people who were very hopeful. They were naive, but they were very hopeful that he would change. They did not understand that Mr. Mnangagwa and the people that had taken over had been an integral part of Mr. Mugabe's regime. As you know, old habits die hard. They have continued with the legacy of Mr. Mugabe for sure, and that is why you hear Mr. Chinamasa, who is a senior member of ZANU-PF, continuing with the rhetoric that accuses the opposition of being Western-funded, as if they themselves, during the liberation struggle, did not get funding from all over the world, including Western countries. That is not to excuse anything, but it is simply to say that people should be seen for who they are. They support themselves, they look after themselves, they are free to express themselves, and it's a political right. This idea of excluding people on the basis of their political affiliation is what has gotten Zimbabwe and many other African countries down. And so it is important for ZANU-PF to really take a more mature honest and sober approach to politics that recognizes everybody else.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Patrick Chinamasa, Alex Magaisa, and David Moore. We really appreciate your contribution to the program. Looking forward to talking to you in the near future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahl Bara, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.